Paul Hudrick was on yesterday when the news about Harden to the Sixers was kind of gaining some steam. Let's get his thoughts now that the Sixers did not make the deal. And also we'll get some thoughts on tonight's game as Paul Hudrick joins us now on the Boardwalk Honda Hotline. Welcome back, Paul. What's going on?
Same old, another day, right?
Well, it's a little different day from yesterday where we thought James Harden might have been playing in this game tonight for the Sixers and Ben Simmons would be gone. Now that the dust has settled, do you feel that the Sixers, avoided a potential, did it work out for them not in the end not making that deal?
It's so hard to tell right now. I think you got to look at it from James Harden, there's no denying how great of a basketball player he is and how well that would have worked offensively with Joel Embiid and the potential there. Yeah, you look at it from that perspective, and this could have been a team that might have been looked at as the favorite to win the Eastern Conference. Now it's not as much. Quite frankly, it's the bottom line. It would have improved the team to that degree. But at the same time, you have to look what Houston got from Brooklyn. Brooklyn gave up three of their own first-round picks, and then they got another first-rounder from Milwaukee via Cleveland, and they got 4 pick swaps beyond that. So, and listen, we all remember what happened the last time the Brooklyn Nets made a deal like this and how that turned out. So, yeah, it's a risky move for the Nets. It's like undoubtedly it adds intrigue to them, and it makes them the most talented roster in the Eastern Conference. Whether that's going to make them the best team in the Eastern Conference and catapult them to the finals, we'll see. But it's such an interesting dynamic when you look at everything that went down, and like you said, it looked like it was pretty close to happening. You said Mark Stein had some tweets that indicated that it was pretty close, and that it seemed like Tyrese Maxey being included in the deal was one of the sticking points for the Sixers, which, of all the deals that were discussed and throwing Maxey in as well, I think the bottom line is, Mike, Daryl Morey had to have a walking away point because you can't just give up everything. And I think that was he clearly reached his walking away point on the deal. So as of right now, yeah, I understand some sting that the Sixers fans might feel from not getting Harden, but it might wind up working out in the long run.
Doesn't it kind of work out? Don't we trust the fact that if Morey backed out of the deal or didn't pull the trigger, shouldn't we be like, oh, my God, they should have done it? Or, doesn't Morey's presence make you feel more comfortable that they don't pull the trigger?
Yeah, for me, and that's kind of what I said to people on Twitter that were asking me about it, is I think especially not only given the fact that Morey has such a great track record as a front office person, and then even here what he's already done with this roster, but the fact that he knows James Harden intimately as a basketball player, as a person, he knows it makes James Harden tick, and so he kind of has an inside advantage on a lot of other GMs around the league where he has that kind of intel. So in a way, if I'm a Sixers fan, yeah, I think you kind of do have to trust Daryl Morey a little bit and trust that where his walking away point was the correct one. And again, when you look at the deal that the Nets offered, it's not nothing. It's a lot. And then the picks are a lot, but then also, a sneaky part of that deal was them giving up Jared Allen. Jared Allen has been really good for the Nets, and you're talking about a team that already couldn't defend and was struggling to defend. Now you're taking a guy like Jared Allen out of that equation and adding a James Harden. Like right now, they're backcourt of Kyrie Irving and James Harden. That's a defensive nightmare. Quite frankly, offensively, it's unbelievable, but defensively, that's a nightmare. So, yeah, I think to an extent you have to trust that Daryl Morey has some – and here's the other part of this, Mike, is that maybe what we talked about yesterday where Bradley Beal becomes available, and maybe either you don't have to give up as much, or maybe you see a path where Beal would be more agreeable to staying here longer. Maybe he would fit better with Joel Embiid. So I do think – you have to give Daryl Morey the benefit of the doubt, and I think if you're a Sixers fan, I think it's safe to trust him.
How do you think this impacts Ben when it comes to playing on the court? Now they have a game tonight, and everybody's fully aware that he was legitimately being discussed to get traded. And I know this happened earlier before the season started, but this one felt different. So, how do you think this impacts Ben?
I have to be honest, just from the little I've been around Ben Simmons a little bit. I know him a little bit. I don't think this really affects him at all. I think that he's a guy who is so focused on just playing basketball and I think he's really good at just blocking this kind of stuff out. Now, listen, he's human because, any guy who's, and like you said, Rhodes, I think yesterday was as real as it felt. It felt very real. It felt like it was, to me at least, I thought it was going to happen. I really did. It felt like we were at that point. It was the realest it has felt. So from that standpoint, I think from a human being standpoint, I'm sure he felt it a little bit. As far as how that's going to affect him, like, do I think he's going to be, upset with the Sixers? Do I think he's going to take it out on anybody? Do I think it's really going to affect him on the court? I don't think so. I really don't. I know some people have this notion of perhaps this lights a fire under him a little bit. Yeah, maybe it does, and you would hope that it does. The fact that they were willing to move on from him and bring in James Harden. But at the same time, I think Ben understands it is a business. It is not under his control. And listen, the guy he was about to get traded for was James Harden, a former MVP in this league, one of the historically greatest offensive players to ever play this game. So I don't think Ben Simmons would take it as a slight. And then also the other factor is ultimately they didn't do it. So they valued him. They did put a point where they said, okay, well, we don't want to give all of this up. And we'd rather keep Ben Simmons and go about it with what we have. So from a personal standpoint, I don't think it's really going to affect him too much, but I understand the idea of maybe what some people are hoping is that maybe this does light a little bit of a fire under him. It certainly adds more pressure to him. That's for sure. That's for certain.
How much of this do you think Houston picked up the phone, going to Philadelphia, hearing a trade offer, and then going to Brooklyn saying, hey, I just talked to Philadelphia. They had Ben Simmons, Tyrese Maxey, and Matisse Thybulle on the table. What do you have for me to up the ante? Almost as if they're just using the Sixers as leverage.
Well, I think in any trade, it's kind of like that, right? I mean, you're pinning one team against the other. Everyone knew those are the two teams that Harden really, they were the top of his list. Nets were number one, Sixers number two. And then just when you're talking about packages, even going into the day, that was the report, is that it's Nets and Sixers, and then we kind of saw where they went. And my guess would be is that what you're saying is correct, is that the Nets had a package already on the table of multiple picks, and maybe that deal, having Indiana involved so that they get a Victor Oladipo out of that. And maybe it wasn't as much. And then they went to the Sixers, and the Sixers said, okay, well, we'll give you Ben Simmons, Matisse Thybulle, and picks. And then they go back to the Nets, and the Nets offer that deal. And then maybe they go back to the Sixers, and they say, well, we want Tyrese Maxey then too. And then that might have been the walking away point for Daryl Morey. We don't know 100%. I mean, we're just really going off of the reports and everything we saw. So I'm sure there was a lot of that with the Rockets, with them, as much as they were desperate to move on because of what Harden was doing and his behavior and the issues he was kind of causing. Clearly, they were pinning the Nets and the Sixers against each other, and ultimately the Nets they had a little bit of an offer. I don't think we can undersell the fact that Oladipo, the Rockets get a guy who is coming off an injury, but is a former All-Star. Expiring contract, and maybe they think him and Wall could make something work long term if Oladipo can return to that form. So again, I just think the Sixers had a walking away point. The Nets upped the ante, and ultimately the Nets had the offer that the Rockets found more attractive.
Let me ask you about it's early in the season. I mean, they got a lot to still evaluate. There might come a point where they think Ben Simmons has to move. But if they kept Ben Simmons and were to make a trade, what does this team need to add to it if they want to keep with what they have instead of breaking up with what they have to kind of start with somebody different? Like if they want to keep Joel and Ben, what do you think needs to be added to Joel and Ben and Tobias and Curry?
A shot creator, 100%, a guy who can create off the dribble, create an offense for himself and for others. I mean, that's what they need. And a guy who they can just, as great as Joel Embiid was down the stretch and as great as he has been so far this season, they still need another guy on the perimeter that they could just give the ball to and say, go get a bucket. And they just flat out do not have that guy. And that, to me, could be the difference between them, being a pretty good team and a team that maybe competes in the Eastern Conference. And look, as we talked about pretty often, Daryl Morey is not going to just sit back and watch. He was in on James Harden. It seems pretty clear they were in on that. So if anything comes up, whether it's a Bradley Beal or whether it's a lesser move, Daryl Morey is going to get in on it. He is going to have talks with teams. this roster we see right now is not the roster we're going to see when this team enters the playoffs. I can almost guarantee that. They're going to look different. And whether that's upgrades around the margins or whether that's a blockbuster move, I'm not sure. But yeah, Mike, I think they can find players that can maybe not be as sexy as a James Harden or a Bradley Beal, but ones that can make a pretty significant impact and perhaps, raise the tier of where this team is and maybe make them an Eastern Conference contender.
If Ben Simmons is in the conversations for Harden, Bradley Beal, everyone's so frustrated they're like trying to run him out of town. Another name that gets brought up is Zach LaVine. Now, I just think that is such a different level of player that, if you're talking about Ben in the same aspect as these other guys I mentioned, I don't know. I don't personally see the connection, but what say you?
Yeah, listen, I like LaVine more than maybe some other people do. And again, with his fit, the way he can create his own offense, the way he can shoot from the outside, it's a clear fit from the Sixers standpoint. But yeah, if you have to give up Ben Simmons to get it, I don't think that's the guy I'm targeting. If I'm looking at Ben Simmons, first of all, I'm not looking to give up Ben Simmons. But if a special player like a James Harden or a Bradley Beal comes along, that's where I'm looking to move on from Ben Simmons. I'm not doing it for Zach LaVine or a guy, and that's not a slight to Zach LaVine, who I think could help this team, who I think could be a pretty good fit. But if there is a deal that the Bulls would take that does not include Ben Simmons, I'm entertaining that. But for me, yeah, I tend to agree with you that I think that's too steep. I'm only trading Ben Simmons if I am getting upper echelon, especially when you factor in he's 24 years old, he's signed for the next 5 years. Like that's the other big part of this. So, yeah, I'm only doing it if I'm getting an upper echelon superstar player in return.
Paul Hudrick at Paul Hudrick on Twitter, 97.3 ESPN.com for his Sixers coverage. Does this place the Nets for you at the top of the East?
It's so hard because we just don't know so many things. And this isn't a cop-out. I mean, we look at how COVID has already affected the season and how it's not just the Sixers. We see what it's done to the Celtics, what it's doing currently to the Heat, and in the Western Conference, what it's doing to the Mavericks and the Suns. So the NBA and the teams are going to have to weather these storms. It's probably going to hit everybody to some extent at some point. So I think from that standpoint, it's so hard to know where these teams are going to be as far as who is the best team in the East. I mean, the Sixers were looking pretty darn good until this happened to them. They were 7-1 going into that Brooklyn game. Then, they find out Seth Curry has a positive test in the first quarter. Clearly that affected them mentally, I think, for the rest of that game. And then after everything that's going on, it's so hard to gauge where they are. So there's just so much I think we still have to figure out. And I think that's part of also Daryl Morey's thinking. Of course, when a player like James Harden becomes available, you have to have those conversations. You have to be involved. But I don't think Morey was necessarily in a hurry to do something like that because he was still trying to get a grasp for what this team is and where they could be. So are the Nets the favorites? Maybe, but I still really like what the Milwaukee Bucks have. I still really like them, playing defense against that roster when you have a Giannis and you have a Jrue Holiday and you have a Brook Lopez at the rim and you have a Chris Middleton. So I still think the Bucks match up really well. So, yeah, I already think the Nets were in that conversation to be one of the top teams in the East, and this move on paper does make them better.
I want to get your thoughts on Joel Embiid because you've obviously seen him the last couple of years, but what looks different about him? You wrote about it in your takeaways the other night at 97.3 ESPN.com. MVP, meaning Embiid VP here. He looks like a more is aggressive or just more focused player?
I think it's everything. I think sometimes we all lose sight of the fact that these guys are so young. Joel Embiid is 26 years old. He also just became a father for the first time. So these things have a tendency, age and then events in your life have a tendency to mature you. So I think that's a part of it, is just a maturity and a focus, as you said. And, he hired a world-class nutritionist this offseason to get him right. So I think I think the focus is part of it, and that's led to him taking these steps to make sure he is better. And I think that's a huge part of it, is that he is understanding and realizing the opportunity he has, how special he can be, And when you put a Doc Rivers in charge too, I think he's got extra motivation to, from a guy like Doc Rivers, he's got extra motivation with a guy like Daryl Morey running things. And then the roster that's around him is just, he's surrounded, when they're at full strength, he's surrounded by shooters and a better fitting starting five. So I think these are all factors that are leading to him, I think, playing, to me, not only just the best basketball as far as pure production, but the most efficient, the smartest brand of basketball we've seen him play in his career. And I think all of that's a factor. And, he was so dominant, and it was beyond anything from what I've seen of him even in that Miami game. Just the way he took the game over and basically said, we are not going to lose tonight. That's something where, we've seen it in spurts, but the specialness of that night was beyond anything I've seen from him so far.
Yeah, and the look in his face. I mean, he just had this look of just a different focus point in that game. Hopefully it carries over. We've seen Embiid have monster nights before. Let's see how he carries it over tonight. You can hear the game at 7 o'clock right here on 97.3 ESPN. Paul Hudrick, of course, at Paul Hudrick. You can follow him on Twitter there. And Kevin McCormick will be on tonight at 6:20 during game night. He is live at the Wells Fargo Center for Sixers Heat, and you can only hear that game right here on 97.3 ESPN. All right, Paul, we'll catch up with you tomorrow.
Sounds good, Mike.
All right, Paul Hudrick inside the Sixers here on the Sports Bash.